Transport of CO2 in the blood is relatively more complicated topic. So I want to start by saying a few words about chemical equilibrium. So if we imagine a reaction something like this, A plus B, C plus D, so those are reactants, those are products, and reaction can go both ways. It can go from right to left, from left to right. So what will shift the equilibrium to the right? Either increased concentration of the reactants, or if we can somehow remove one of the products from the reaction mixture. For instance, D precipitates, forms a precipitate at the bottom of the tube, or it evaporates, somehow removed. So that is really an important thing that I want you to appreciate before we talk about CO2 transport. CO2 transport. There are three main ways. So first, let's say this is plasma, and this is a pretty big red blood cell. So in the plasma, CO2 dissolves in plasma. When it dissolves in plasma, it reacts with water, forming carbonic acid. Sorry about that. Carbonic acid, which is, as you know, dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen. How do we shift the equilibrium to the right? Let me get rid of that red blood cell here. We need to remove one of the products from the sort of a reaction area. How we do it? We take this hydrogen and bind it to albumin. So that hydrogen ion gets sequestered, gets kind of removed, gets bound to the albumin, and it's transported. It sits bound to the albumin in the blood during the whole transport. Now, another part of the transport, not really super important, is CO2 binds to the protein of hemoglobin, forming carbamino hemoglobin. So we've got plasma transport when hydrogen binds to the albumin. We've got CO2 that binds to the protein component of hemoglobin, but the most important, of course, is the transport of carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate inside of the red blood cells. So carbon dioxide binds to water, interacts with water in the red blood cell, forming carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. In order to shift the equilibrium to the right, we need to remove that hydrogen ion. That's going to be a plus. We need to remove the hydrogen ion from the reaction kind of sphere. In the plasma, we did that by binding hydrogen to albumin. What about red blood cell? What's the most common protein in the red blood cell? It's hemoglobin. So hydrogen binds to hemoglobin, okay, and forms this complex. What is absolutely fascinating is that, if you remember, so at this point, hemoglobin, we call it oxyhemoglobin. It's hemoglobin and oxygen on it. when hydrogen binds to hemoglobin, that changes the shape of hemoglobin, so hemoglobin releases oxygen into the tissues. So here you can see how that specific process of carbon dioxide transport can facilitate the unloading of oxygen in the tissues. And let me just wrap it up and just go over CO2 one more time. So in the plasma, CO2 binds, interacts with water, forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen. Hydrogen binds to albumin. In the red blood cell, CO2 can bind to a protein component of hemoglobin, forming carbaminohemoglobin, or can form bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. And hydrogen ion will interact with the oxyhemoglobin. That interaction will liberate oxygen, and hydrogen will be bound to hemoglobin. What's so fascinating about it? The more CO2 you have, the more hydrogen ion is produced. The more hydrogen ion is produced, the more oxygen is liberated. And that harkens back to our conversation about the role of CO2 in oxygen unloading. The higher the CO2, the more oxygen is being unloaded. What happens in the lungs? We can basically turn all arrows back. In a red blood cell, hydrogen gets liberated from hemoglobin. And I want to point your attention that when hydrogen gets liberated from hemoglobin, hemoglobin can bind oxygen now, which happens in the lungs, right? So it recombines with bicarbonate, forming carbonic acid. Carbonic acid splits into CO2 and water. CO2 is getting exhaled. CO2 gets liberated from carbaminohemoglobin. And hydrogen ion gets liberated from albumin, recombines with bicarbonate, forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid splits into CO2 and water. CO2 is getting exhaled.